The winter of 1944 was not kind to Europe. The fields of the Ardennes were silent but for the dull crack of rifle fire and the low groan of engines buried in frost. American snipers crouched in the cold, their breath hanging in the air like smoke. They were supposed to be the eyes of the infantry, the quiet, deadly precision that kept advancing troops alive. But that winter, the fog came down so thick that even their scopes turned against them. The lenses that once gave them clarity were now their blindfolds. Moisture crept into the barrels, condensation clouded the glass, and when the snipers aimed, all they saw was blur, a gray, ghostly haze where the enemy might be or might not. At the front lines, soldiers cursed their scopes. They would wipe, blow, rub, even breathe warm air across the glass, but nothing worked for long. Within seconds, the fog returned. For a sniper, a second was everything. It meant the difference between life and death. Back in the U.S., the Army Ordnance Department was flooded with reports. The issue was everywhere, from the forests of Belgium to the mountains of Italy and the Pacific jungles. Each time humidity or cold set in, the scopes became useless. Engineers at Springfield Armory, the country's primary weapons development facility, worked furiously. They tried heating the lenses, sealing them, coating them with special chemicals, but the problem persisted. In technical terms, it was simple physics. The scopes were airtight tubes containing lenses of glass and metal. When the external temperature changed rapidly, from the warmth of a soldier's hands to the icy air outside, condensation formed on the inside of the glass. It was the same reason a pair of glasses fogs up when stepping out into the cold. But this wasn't about eyeglasses, it was about survival. The Ordnance Department spent months and thousands of dollars chasing solutions. The U.S. Army Signal Corps tested moisture-resistant coatings. The Navy Bureau of Ordnance looked at vacuum-sealed optics. The Air Corps studied pilot goggles for inspiration. Yet every field report came back the same: fog. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Germans were running into similar problems. Their legendary Carabiner 98K rifles, often equipped with Zeiss scopes, also suffered from fogging in harsh conditions. Even the high-quality optics of the Wehrmacht couldn't defeat nature. Soldiers resorted to makeshift fixes, wiping the glass with grease, heating the lenses near campfires, even urinating on them to clear frost. Nothing lasted more than a few shots. By 1943, the U.S. military declared it a priority optics problem. Commanders wanted answers, and fast. American snipers, who once had the edge in accuracy, were losing effectiveness in cold and damp conditions. Morale dropped. The Army needed a breakthrough, not in firepower, but in something far simpler: visibility. That breakthrough didn't come from a government lab. It came from a cluttered workbench in a jewelry store in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His name was Samuel Reuben. He wasn't a scientist, an engineer, or a soldier. He was a jeweler, a man who spent his life polishing tiny glass stones and adjusting the minute gears of pocket watches. His shop smelled of metal filings, soap, and oil. On his bench lay an assortment of magnifying lenses, polishing wheels, and glass cleaner. To most people, it was just a jeweler's mess. But to Reuben, it was a world of precision. A world where clarity was everything. One day, a local machinist, a regular customer, came in with a small scratched rifle scope. "Can you clean this?" he asked. Reuben looked at it curiously. The glass inside was fogged, just like a cheap watch he'd seen once that trapped moisture under the crystal. He unscrewed the scope, looked through the lenses, and frowned. The problem was familiar. He'd spent years fighting condensation inside watches and optical lenses. In his line of work, even the smallest moisture droplet could ruin the shine of a gemstone or the precision of a clock face. He asked the machinist what caused it. "Cold," the man replied. "The boys say the fog comes in when the scope warms up too fast." That night, Reuben stayed up in his shop long after closing. He held the disassembled scope under the lamplight, peering through it as though searching for the secret inside. He tried wiping it clean, reheating it, cooling it again, and sure enough, the glass fogged. It wasn't magic, it was chemistry. He recalled something from his years of lens polishing, a special mixture of soap and alcohol he used to prevent fog on the inside of magnifying glasses. It was something no military engineer would think of because it came not from science, but from habit. A jeweler's trick. The next morning, he tried it. He applied a thin film of a hand-mixed polish, part soap, part fine jeweler's compound, and part alcohol. When it dried, it left a microscopic layer across the glass, invisible but hydrophobic. Water vapor couldn't cling to it. He held the scope near the fire, then brought it out into the cold. No fog. He repeated the test, still clear. It seemed too simple, too ridiculous. He sent word to a local gunsmith who tested it on a few rifles. The results were the same. The scopes stayed clear. A few weeks later, the Army heard of it. At first, they laughed. The idea that a jeweler's polish could outperform months of government research seemed absurd. But desperation has a way of humbling even the proudest bureaucrats. They sent an officer to Pittsburgh to see it firsthand. When he arrived, Reuben demonstrated the trick. He fogged one untreated scope, then held up his treated one beside it. In the same breath, one lens clouded completely while the other stayed crystal clear. The officer didn't say a word. He simply nodded. Within a month, Reuben was working with the Ordnance Department, teaching technicians how to apply his polish to scopes before they were shipped overseas. His mad trick, as they jokingly called it, short for moisture-absorbing deterrent, wasn't in any manual, and it wasn't patented. It was born out of intuition, not engineering. By the time Allied forces were pushing into Germany, thousands of scopes had been treated using his formula. Field reports noted dramatic improvement in visibility. Snipers began hitting targets again at long range, even in freezing fog. No one outside the small circle of engineers knew who Samuel Reuben was. His name never appeared in any official document, but the soldiers who could finally see through their scopes owed their vision, quite literally, to a jeweler from Pittsburgh. By early 1945, word of the jeweler's miracle began to spread quietly through the ranks. In field camps and sniper schools, whispers circulated about a strange soap trick that made scopes immune to fog. No one could explain it, but every man who used one swore it worked. In a war that had turned machines into gods, with tanks, planes, and rockets deciding fate, it was strange that something as humble as a jeweler's polish could make such an impact. Yet it was this simplicity that made it unstoppable. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the Army began formal testing. They brought in batches of scopes, Weaver, Lyman, and Unertol models, coated with Reuben's mixture. The tests were brutal. Rapid temperature shifts from heated chambers to cold lockers, simulated rain, humidity blasts. In every case, the treated lenses resisted fogging better than any official coating. The scientists called it a surface treatment demonstrating superior hydrophobic behavior under condensation. Reuben just called it soap. His formula was deceptively simple: a base of ivory soap, a small amount of ethyl alcohol, and a trace of fine jeweler's rouge, the red powder he used for polishing gemstones. When applied and buffed thin, it left behind a layer that repelled water molecules. He hadn't invented it overnight. Reuben later admitted he'd stumbled upon the idea years earlier when he was repairing an old magnifying lens that fogged while he worked. He'd tried a dab of polishing soap to keep the surface clean and noticed it stayed clearer longer. It was a tiny, forgettable observation until the day that rifle scope came into his shop. The Army engineers were astonished. Their labs had experimented with silica coatings, oil films, even vacuum sealing, yet none performed as consistently. They asked Reuben for his formula. He refused to hand it over outright.
Instead, he taught them how to make it, step by step, the way a craftsman trains an apprentice. There was no patent, no scientific paper, no technical blueprint, just a small man with steady hands showing a room full of soldiers how to mix polish in a coffee tin. In the months that followed, military depots began adopting the technique. Thousands of sniper scopes, binoculars, and even periscope lenses on Sherman tanks were treated using Reuben's process. For the first time since the war began, field optics stayed clear through mist, snow, and even jungle humidity. Reports poured in from Europe. Visibility remains intact under all weather. Snipers reporting improved accuracy. No fogging detected in recent engagements. One sniper's letter from the 101st Airborne read, "The boys call it the magic glass. I shot through fog this morning like it wasn't even there. Can't say how they did it, but I owe whoever figured it out my life." In the Pacific, the results were even more dramatic. The U.S. Marines, who had been fighting in sweltering humidity on islands like Peleliu and Okinawa, found their scopes were no longer useless after a few minutes in the jungle heat. They didn't know why and didn't care. All they knew was that it worked. Reuben's secret formula was now considered classified military material. Though unofficial, it was quietly distributed through the ordnance channels as Fog Preventative Compound No. 7. The Army would later adapt it for aviation goggles and even submarine periscopes. Back home in Pittsburgh, Samuel Reuben continued working at his small jewelry shop, mostly unaware of the growing legend surrounding his name. His wife Ruth would later say he didn't care for recognition. He thought of himself as a craftsman, not an inventor. If something worked, that was enough.
But to those who understood optics, Reuben had done something extraordinary. He had solved a problem that eluded entire research divisions, not through engineering, but through observation, patience, and the instincts of someone who worked with glass every day. When a colonel from the Ordnance Department visited him to offer an honorary contract, Reuben reportedly smiled and said, "I'm not a soldier, sir. I just make things clear." He refused the offer. He didn't want to leave his shop. He preferred his familiar world, polishing rings, repairing watches, and cleaning lenses for his neighborhood customers. Yet, without meaning to, his creation was shaping the course of battles thousands of miles away. In February 1945, near the German town of Prüm, fog rolled in so thick that entire companies disappeared into white nothingness. American forces halted, except for their snipers. They could still see. Hidden behind stone walls and ruined buildings, they picked off enemy machine gunners through scopes treated with Reuben's mixture. The Germans, blinded by fogged optics, never understood how they were being targeted so precisely. In military reports, commanders called it the visibility advantage. To historians later, it would seem minor, a small footnote in a vast war of tanks and bombers. But for the soldiers who lived through those frozen mornings, the difference between life and death often came down to what they could see. By the time the war in Europe ended, the Army had integrated Reuben's formula into their standard optical maintenance kits. The U.S. Navy soon adopted it for rangefinder lenses on warships, ensuring visibility during sea fog. The Air Corps experimented with similar coatings for aircraft instruments. Reuben's trick, originally dismissed as mad by skeptical engineers, became military doctrine. And yet, in the flood of post-war innovations, radar, jet engines, atomic science, his story was lost. No medal, no newspaper headline, no museum plaque bore his name. Just a line in an internal memo from 1945. Field scopes treated with civilian formula tested in Pennsylvania show consistent anti-fog performance. Recommend continued use. The rest was buried under paperwork. But among the few who remembered, Reuben became a quiet legend.
the jeweler, who saw what scientists didn't. He had reminded the world of something crucial, that war, for all its machines and factories, still depended on the creativity of ordinary minds.
The war ended, but the technology that carried it forward didn't stop marching. The innovations born in chaos, radar, penicillin, jet propulsion, now fueled peace. Soldiers came home, factories retooled, and engineers turned to rebuilding what had been destroyed. Yet somewhere in the quiet streets of Pittsburgh, an old jeweler continued polishing glass, unaware that his idea had followed the same path as those great inventions. By 1946, the U.S. military had begun cataloging every major innovation used during the war. Committees combed through files, patents, and laboratory notes to determine which wartime discoveries could be adapted for civilian use. Buried deep in an ordnance report, a line caught a young scientist's eye. Soap-based hydrophobic coating, field effective under all weather. That scientist, a young optical engineer named Dr. Henry Wallace, was fascinated. He tracked down the origins of the formula, only to find no registered patent, just the initials, SR, scribbled beside the note. When he finally located Reuben's small shop in Pittsburgh, he found the jeweler exactly as the records described, quiet, polite, and skeptical that his work had mattered. He asked him to demonstrate the process again. Reuben obliged. He mixed the paste, polished a piece of glass, and breathed on it. The fog dispersed instantly. Wallace stared, stunned. That day marked something new. Wallace took Reuben's principle, the idea that a micro-thin layer could repel moisture, and began refining it for commercial optics. The result would become the foundation of modern anti-fog coatings, used in everything from diving masks to eyeglasses and camera lenses. Reuben never claimed credit. He declined co-authorship on Wallace's research paper, saying, "I'm just happy people can see better now." But history has a strange way of forgetting the simplest heroes. By the 1950s, anti-fog lens coatings had become standard in military optics and aviation instruments. Sniper scopes, periscopes, and even photographic equipment used similar chemical treatments, some nearly identical to Reuben's soap-based formula. Yet his name appeared nowhere. To the military, it was just hydrophobic treatment type R. To those who knew, it was still the jeweler's trick. Reuben lived out the rest of his life quietly, rarely speaking about his wartime contribution. He was more interested in the work before him than the legacy behind him. When asked by a local reporter in the 1960s if he ever regretted not patenting his invention, he simply replied, "You can't patent common sense." Meanwhile, his discovery traveled farther than he ever imagined. In Korea, Vietnam, and later in Afghanistan, soldiers continued to rely on anti-fog coatings derived from the same principle. Decades later, when modern optical companies like Zeiss, Nikon, and Leupold developed their multi-coating technologies, they still built upon the foundation he laid, keeping vision clear through moisture and temperature shifts. Even NASA, when developing helmet visors for the Apollo astronauts, referenced early Army anti-fog treatments in their designs. The same basic idea, a thin hydrophobic film to stop condensation, found its way to the surface of a moon visor. It all began with a man who repaired watches. Today, historians digging through dusty ordnance archives occasionally stumble upon the old reports from 1944, 1945, the field memos, the testing notes, the line that simply reads, "Civilian formula, effective in all climates." They rarely find his name, but they find his fingerprints on history, invisible like the coating he once polished onto glass. Samuel Reuben passed away in the late 1960s. No obituary mentioned his contribution to the war effort, but among the veterans who had served in the cold forests of Europe or the jungles of the Pacific, some still remembered. One old sniper interviewed decades later put it best,
We couldn't see a damn thing until that soap trick came along. Whoever figured that out, he was one of us, a real soldier, even if he never fired a shot. And that's maybe what made Reuben's story so powerful. He never sought glory or recognition. His hands were too busy crafting precision to worry about fame. In a war fought with science and steel, he had proven that sometimes the smallest ideas, born not in laboratories but in humble workshops, could change the outcome of battles. His mad trick became a cornerstone of modern optics, a quiet revolution that let humanity see more clearly through fog, through time, and through history. It's easy to forget the name of a jeweler from Pittsburgh, but every time a soldier wipes a scope clean and still sees the world sharp and true, his work lives on. So the next time you look through a lens, your camera, your glasses, even your phone, and it doesn't fog up, remember that behind that clarity was one man's stubborn belief that there's always a simple way to see through the blur. Because sometimes the clearest vision comes not from invention, but from intuition. Thank you for watching this story of forgotten brilliance and wartime ingenuity. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories of innovation and courage. And in the comments, tell us your favorite part of this story. Which moment inspired you the most?